This morning we are addressing the topic of the eighth commandment, and the eighth commandment, of course, is thou shalt not steal. And there's lots of underlying implications to this that I'm going to be spending most of my time on. I want to be sure I say right up front, in case you don't know, I am no economist. I am not I don't have a doctorate in economy and finance, in governmental regulations. I simply want to approach the subject of the eighth commandment from a biblical world and life view. And so some of the things I'm going to say will be only foundational to the issues that we come across. And I just want to put that out there for that. Let's start with some general principles regarding you shall not steal. Inherent in that commandment is the understanding and the right of personal ownership. Now that right there, of course, you might say, well, doesn't that figure? But there are, if you are not aware, there are governmental systems, there are approaches to society that want to deny even that there isn't any such thing, and that we should not think to gain personal accumulation of property because that lends to imbalance and injustice and to abuse even of other people. But one of the foundational principles of this commandment is that if you're going to steal something, it has to be yours to begin with. And it has to be something that you can claim. Such ownership as we are to have is something that has to be socially recognized. It has to be something that everybody appreciates, in that, yes, indeed, there is that which belongs to you and that which belongs to me, and that is not only to be recognized, it is to be defended. It is something that I have a right to say, this is mine, you shall not have it, and you are not free to come and take it. Stealing, in other words, has to be more than just a social offense. God declares that it is morally sinful, being in one of the Ten Commandments, in the list of the Ten Commandments. He's declaring the heinousness of this act and how important it is for us to recognize that it is not just breaking the law, it is not just taking advantage of somebody else, but there is a moral principle behind it. And that is a sin that is done before Him, not just before man's law, and it's an affront to God's very name. So the concept of property is inherent in this commandment. And that means that it's inherent to an understanding of social order and structure. We are indeed to build our structure and our social order around this concept rather than reject it. The right and duty of personal responsibility is implied, that once you own something, it is yours to take care of. You have a duty to watch over animals, for instance. You have a duty to your neighbor to keep your house in order. You have a responsibility to invest your wealth. You have charges that are given to you because of that. And you have accountability. If nothing else, you have an accountability to God, who is telling you, what will you do with what I give you? And the proper enjoyment of the material property and wealth of this age is also implied. If you own something, it is for your perfect benefit. It is for your blessing and your benefit. It is for your profit. It is for your prosperity. It is for the enhancing of your circumstances, and that you are to enjoy those things with the understanding that as a Christian, you have the world and life view that would understand that all of this is going to pass away. So nothing is permanent. So while you have it and you enjoy it and you use it and you protect it, you hold everything in this world with a loose hand, because that everything in this world will be taken away from us eventually. So the most unique thing about the world and life view that the Bible gives to us regarding the ownership of property and the commandment not to steal is the origin of all things comes from God. Now this is, as I said, this is remarkably unique when you think of other religions or other ancient creation stories. There is no such thing as a God creating and owning all that exists. Things either happen by accident or by war or by fluke, but any other attempt at explaining the origin of material things, the world and all that's in it, does not lend itself to ownership from the very beginning. Only Christianity or only the Judeo-Christian message does. Only the Bible's message tells us that God created all things and all things belong to Him. All things belong to Him. Psalm 89 says, "The heavens are yours, the earth also is yours, the world and all that is in it. You have founded them. It all belongs to you. It is therefore not only your ownership, it is there for your purpose. It is there for all your glory. Everything is for God." And that is where the origin of all things start. Everything in the entire universe is made by God, claimed by God, possesses express purpose for God, ceases to exist when God is finished with it, as Revelation tells us. And as man is at the center of that divine purpose, material possessions are given into his hand that man may serve God and God's designs with his stewardship, with the care that he gives to those things. Okay, going on with that origin question or issue, all is to be held and used and enjoyed with care, guardedness, and propriety. And we pull from the Sermon on the Mount in this regard. The three verses that Jesus says in succession tells us a great deal about this. That he says in Matthew 6:19, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal." So he's saying the things on earth are susceptible to theft. Your property is susceptible to being stolen. And what you guard and what you protect is against that, but you always want to remember that the priority is not to be building up your kingdom on earth. All things belong to God, and you want to serve Him with that. So all things are to be held and used with care, guardedness, and propriety, but also then with proper priority, value, and care. He says in the very next verse, "But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal." So your priority is to build up your affections and your loyalties and your strengths and your services toward God and not toward the accumulation and the protection of things on earth. And then in Matthew 6:21 he continues and he says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And that's teaching us that even possessions have a moral value to them. A moral value that you will either use or abuse. You will either covet your things on earth, you will extend yourself in protecting them and in guarding them and renewing them because you're building your treasure on earth, or else you will see that they have a purpose before God and that they should be about that purpose, and you should be ready to give them up when the time comes. Now, an illustration of that, of course, it comes from the parable of the talents. Jesus tells this parable very deliberately to speak of property and ownership and investment. And I always like telling this, a parable, when I read it, especially to kids or something. I'll read the whole parable. You can remind yourself of what it says. The master gives different talents to three different servants and then comes back and calls into account. And I say, "And what is the point of the parable?" And, most of the time the kids will say, invest money, spend wisely, do all those kind of things. And I say, no, the point of the parable is Jesus is coming back. He will say, what have you done with what I have given you? And so that's the accountability of our possessions is a very important aspect. So in that parable, it starts off with the king giving up his property, what belongs rightly to him, and he gives that to three different servants. He gives one 5 talents, another 3 talents, another 1 talent. The money is obviously the investment is different from us, but the responsibility is there, and it's not equally given. There is nothing in God's granting of responsibility to us that says God has to treat us fairly. In fact, I don't even think the Bible speaks of describing God as fair anywhere. But that is one of the first things that we always want to hold against him, is that, well, no, God is fair, and therefore he wants everybody else to be treated with equity. That's the word that's used today. And that nobody should have more than anybody else and all that kind of stuff. But that's exactly the opposite of what the Scriptures teach. The Scriptures say that God does not have to give fairly to anyone. He gives deliberately for his own glory, and he does so with a purpose in mind. And the exercise of the parable demonstrates that. So he says he gives his property, he gives to one servant 5 talents, obviously thinking that he is more responsible, more experienced, more able to do something with it. He gives another one 3 and another one 1, based on his estimation of their abilities and of their loyalty to him. So he knows them. And so that also is not equal or balanced. The rest of the parable goes into the fact that the servants then go into trading, they invest it, they increase it, there is prospering before it, and all of those things are pleasing to God. When the man comes back, the first two servants bring their talents to him, and he praises them, gives them more responsibility for what they have been able to do. The third one, however, is afraid of losing the responsibility or handling the responsibility. He goes, he hides the man's money and returns it to him uninvested, untouched, thinking that he has accomplished, at least he hasn't lost it. That's what's going on in his mind. And you know how the parable ends, with the man is angry with that servant. More angry than he would be if he had invested and lost, because he did not regard his charge before God or before the master with care and responsibility. So, one of the implications of that illustration is that the reward for faithfulness is more. When you work hard unto the Lord, and you regard the propriety and the priority and the loose hand that we are to have in this world, the reward God gives us will be more blessing, more favor, and there's more pleasure from God and more blessing as a result. The punishment for unfaithfulness is even less. What Jesus says is what you have will be taken from you. You will lose when you don't live in faith, when you don't live to the glory of God, when you are not investing. You will lose what you have. And that's an implication of the parable as well. There is also the harsh rebuke from the master, which represents the punishment from God for not taking his charge and his duty seriously, judgment and condemnation for what amounts to sin before the master. Now, the question always comes up with this particular parable: is this talking only about spiritual gifts? Maybe you've heard sermons about this, and say, well, the parable is about spiritual gifts. It's about the ability to teach or to love, serve in the church, and that's all. No, this is talking about all of life, because God is the master of all of life. And we remind ourselves that just as Adam and Eve were charged with care in the garden and over the animals, we are charged today with care for our material possessions. This teaches us that we are not to separate this idea, to compartmentalize this idea that, yes, my service to God is in the church. My service to God is in the home. My service to God is is in those areas of spiritual concern. What I do in my business doesn't concern God. How I run my shop is not God's. God isn't worried about that. I keep God out of that. Those are the compartmentalizings that sometimes we can be guilty of, and the parable is very clear to underscore that is not true. So, how is personal property defined? And this is an interesting tack on this. You know, when you go into when you take economic courses or you read into the history of economics, they will build cases that seem very hypothetical and very theoretical. The Bible doesn't tell us the origin of these things, but it does give us, by way of implication, what we are to conclude from the origin of things. And I think that's very insightful. Let me show you what I mean. How is personal property defined? How would you say property is defined today? How would you say property is defined today? Anybody? Nobody knows? I'll come over and get it then. What does that mean? What does ownership mean? You bought it, okay? You probably have a receipt for something that's important. You have after you buy it, yes, but once, how do you get it? You purchase it. What else? You inherit it. You pay tax on it. Yeah, right. You know, all of those things are implied because somebody else already owned it to begin with, and now you do. So what's the origin of all of this? That's what we're getting at. In Genesis 1, of course, is the verse that we remind ourselves of. He says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion." What does dominion mean? It means authority. It means responsibility. It means, effectively, ownership or stewardship, we would say. So here's Adam and his wife in the garden. There is no previous owner to anything in terms of other human beings. There's nothing to buy from someone else. There's nothing to inherit. There's nothing to gain that way. They take charge of that which is before them. So stewardship is inherent in dominion. The maker of heaven and earth give dominion of creation to mankind. To rule is to possess. I rule something I own. And to rule well is to honor the true owner. I'm a steward of God, and so I want to make sure I do what is right before the Lord. And to rule abusively, on the other hand, is to disavow that ownership and to say, God doesn't matter here. I can do with what I want. And God says, no, that's not true. So there is a vertical identity in regards to stewardship. All is given by God, and all will return to God. But ownership is all about, in a culture, among other people, is all about maintaining society. And so there's a need to cooperate with, to trade, to secure personal peace, etc. To exercise dominion must be something that is done not only individually, but as a corporate body. I own something because I claim it. My society says, yes, you own that, it is yours, and therefore we have peace. And we also have a groundwork for trade and for business and for other things. It's all recognition of that sense of private property. That to maintain that order in society, there's not only that recognition, but there is also a need to develop and increase and subdivide and demonstrate ownership so that you may build on what you have. And the responsibility of ownership is involved in that as well. The duty of passing on property to the next generation is also part of what it means to increase one's wealth. And we'll get to inheritance in a minute. This is one of my favorite paintings. This is done by Fernand Corman in 1880, and it's his imaginative portrayal of Cain and his family as they are drifting off. This is years now after his murder of Abel, and he's leading his little cohort of misfits, and they're headed to Nod because that's where they'll settle. And the point I bring this up is that here's Cain, and he is going out into the world. Nobody has fences, nobody has real estate markings, nobody has property boundaries. There is no previous ownership. Cain is headed to Nod, where he is free to take dominion over everything and anything he sees. That's the origin of property. It all belongs to God, but he gives to Cain whatever he is able to handle and however he is able to take care of it. So there's the origin of property right there. And it's important to understand that being from God, that is how everything starts. We could say the same thing about Noah. When Noah starts to build his ark, where does he get the materials for this? He may have to buy and sell, or he may claim the property where all the lumber is coming from, all the materials, all the supplies. Perhaps there's buying and selling going on. Scripture doesn't tell us. But after the flood is over, the world is his. No other previous ownership. And so he starts the process by claiming and by growing his vineyard and doing whatever else he does in order to accomplish those things. And we know that after the flood, his family spread out in three general ways. We know that Japheth went north, and Shem went east, and Ham went west. And generally speaking, the property before each one of them was there for them to claim and to take without any previous buying and selling going on. But that resulted, you remember, in the Tower of Babel. What was the Tower of Babel? Well, of course, we know it was a challenge to God in his authority. We usually think that it was a tower up to the heavens, meaning that he's going to bring God down. But what really demonstrates is that here is a king, Nimrod in this case, organizing his culture, organizing his society to build something that he could claim as king. So he is taking ownership of this entire area. People are now his servants. He owns them, and he is building something to even throw off the ownership of God over all things. And when that fails and society dissipates, then even those peoples will drift off into directions. And so again, there is a start of the whole economic system by people going and possessing things that aren't there to have to buy. And then, of course, we get to the generations that follow that. And the generations will now inherit what their fathers have taken for the first time and now pass on to them. This is where the right of inheritance comes from. This belonged to my dad, now it belongs to me. And property is assumed under that kind of situation. Even when we get to the Americas, I remember talking about this when we did the Puritans. I don't like, you've heard me say I don't like the word indigenous. Indigenous is a word that is used to excuse the fact that somebody else is natural to a particular area. And we're told the American Indians are indigenous to this, and we had no right to take property from them. And but the word indigenous is false in regards to that, because they too crossed over somewhere from. There's three different theories about where they came from, but they too crossed over and came here somewhere before there was any ownership of any property. And they claimed it they had the opportunity, rather, to claim it for the first time themselves. So they're not indigenous, they came from somewhere else. But they were not of a biblical worldview. They were of a naturalistic worldview. And that meant that they found God in creation, and that they worshiped the Spirit in animals. And in their world life view, they said that nothing belongs to anyone. Now that's a religious understanding of property, but it is in conflict with a biblical one. And so it's not just a hard and fast matter of, of the white man coming over and taking what the Indians originally had. It's a clash in worldview. And it's the Bible that says that if no one owns this, then you are able to claim it. And so that's behind this whole business that's so irritating and so sensitive today. We see the same thing going on in Joshua's invasion of Canaan. We're familiar, for instance, with the harsh way that God instructed Joshua to deal with the Canaanites. First, we're told that the Canaanites' sin was full in the eyes of God. What does that mean? That means they are ready for judgment, just like the people that would die in the flood with Noah. The people in Canaan were full in terms of their sin. And so that makes Joshua's invasion of Canaan something that was exceptional, not regular, not the way that Christians should treat everybody. That's sometimes a criticism is levied against us. But it was an exceptional situation because Canaan was to be gifted to the Israelites by God. And so when they chase them out, when they destroy them, it's the hand of God that's being judged there. And that leaves the land without previous claim. That means that the Israelites don't have to purchase the land from the Canaanites. They don't have to levy the price. They don't have to dicker. The land is before them. And so we read in Joshua that they divide the land up into the 12 tribes. And the tribes inherit from God as if it was land with no previous ownership. The inheritance comes from the Lord. Now, when you look at that map, you'll notice that these aren't equal. There's some that are rather huge. Manasseh's huge, Judah's big, and Manasseh's even split. There's two of them here. No one is saying they're the same. There's equity, there's fairness. The land is divided up according to the size of the tribes, for one thing, which also will vary. Some of them were prospering and some of them were not. And so the land was divided up according to the size of the tribe. But even the position of the tribes could not be seen as fair because there is mountainous territory and then there are rivers and then there are plains. There are situations that are close to enemies and there are others that are not. And there's no equity here. And yet this is the way the Lord would lead the Israelites into the land and gift them with that first charge of ownership and responsibility. And so it reminds us of the parable again of the talents, that we're all given different circumstances as well as different amounts. But we are to do the best with what we have and know that our industry is to the Lord's praise anyway. And so we don't look for a socialistic kind of balance or fairness. We look for the opportunity that God gives us and we make the most of it. So social stewardship requires, relationship with one another, in other words, requires justice and respect for ownership. At first, it starts there. We have to have respect and justice when in dealing with one another. The Levitical laws talk about the need for boundary markers and the heinous sin it is to move those boundary markers, and the law of reciprocity, which is a very interesting law. Roughly speaking, it says that if your neighbor steals your bull is like your tractor. If your neighbor steals your bull and he's prosecuted for it, not only must he return your bull, you get his bull too. And so there is a direct imbalance that is punished or left to thievery. And so the punishment is very important. The opportunity for gain and expansion is very clearly there. Labor and its rewards are before you, and the prosperity you have is a reward from God. There is growth and prosperity. And of course, there's the blessings of inheritance. What you have is to be passed on to your children. It is to be deliberately passed on so that there is an increase from generation to generation to generation. So how is wealth stolen? That gets us back to the commandment, right? Got to set up all of that before we have a legitimate understanding of what it means to steal. But stealing then first of all, recognizes the principle of private property. It's not stealing if it's not yours. And that is one of the objections that we have to deal with in our world today is the whole concept of private property is being attacked, and therefore it's not stealing. So there's several categories just to list, just generally to mention. One of the first categories is blatant aggression. I'm breaking into your house to steal something that is yours. Theft, seizure, murder, deceit, any of those kinds of things that you can imagine that fall under that category of taking something from you deliberately and with purpose of hurting you. But then there is a second category that's spoken of in Scripture about governmental overreach. This can be a tricky question to discuss. First of all, we start with the principle that's given to us in Romans 13 and 1 Peter, that government is proper, social structure is necessary, even for the maintaining of private property. You have to have a governmental structure, and that there is a certain amount of respect and recognition that governmental structure has to be given. The government has to have authority to recognize your private property. It has to have authority to say what somebody else did to you is theft and punish it. Government has the right and authority to support itself by way of taxes, to defend you by way of armies, etc., and all of those things. So there is certain governmental authority that is implied in Scripture, but not all governments, or not all of the ways that man has developed and designed government is going to fit that biblical worldview. Some of them are going to be very unbiblical. They're going to start with the basic principle that there is no God and that somebody else has to call the shots. Communism is first and foremost in that regard. Communism is first and foremost an atheistic worldview. And so it goes with that idea that all things don't return to God, all things belong to us. And so we don't, as Christians, we don't have to recognize the authority of communism. That is not something that we have a responsibility to acknowledge. When we read Romans 13, it's not telling us to support and to be enthusiastic about a communistic government that is over us. The principle of governmental authority, yeah. But not all government recognizes the principle of private property, and that as a moral right before God. This goes way back, by the way. It's not just communism in the 20th century, for instance, but ancient Egypt at the time of Moses was a government that said the king or the Pharaoh is God, and therefore everything belongs to him. It was another way of saying that gods are not, the God of the Bible is not a part of this. That is the whole reason, the story behind the Exodus showdown between the God of the Bible and the God of Pharaoh. Who will win? There had to be one to win because it was a moral principle. All things belong to God of the Scriptures, and that is how the story is concluded. But it applies to ancient Egypt. Assyria was much the same way. There's the modern day experiments of socialism, fascism, the tyrannies where divinity is claimed by mere man. None of that falls under the rubric of something Christians are required by God to submit to happily and pleasantly. No government is beyond the perversion of sin. This is another aspect, of course. Not only may a government be legitimate, but it will also be susceptible to corruption and needs accountability in and of itself. Where does that accountability come from? Thomas Jefferson says it comes from the people. Well, that's slowly but surely deteriorating in the United States. We're losing that accountability because even the accountability has been corrupted. Witherspoon was right. If we are not accountable to God, we will not last as a nation. And so that's one of the fallacies that we're dealing with.
Can I ask you something, Pastor?
Yeah.
Maybe you could speak to this. It's personal overreach is a sin, as defined there. Governmental overreach is sinful. However, Christians have been given certain commands to do when we are sinned against in those ways. For
Right.
example, when our cloak is stolen, we give them our shirt or whatever.
Right?
And the respect even for an overreaching government. Of course, Paul wrote that, and the government was
Right. Rome.
murdering Christians, and so we have these ideals, but the way Christians react to these
Yep.
overreaches is going to be.
I'm only painting with a broad brush, and I appreciate that. What you actually said 2 or 3 different things. You talked about the stealing your cloak in the Sermon on the Mount. That's an individual Christian's response to someone else, and then you mentioned the church, or Paul, speaking of the church in regards to Rome. That's the church society and its relationship to the government, and you can see that those are 2 different things, and we would have to explore them separately. We can't just put them together. But yeah, there's lots more that could be elaborated on. The government is also corrupted in the exercise of conscription. Solomon, for instance, conscripted young men for his army and young women for his palace and for his own service. Governments have been known to exercise abusive taxation upon living as well as the dead, and increasingly strengthening regulations, unfair seizure for the greater good, yada, yada, yada. All those different excuses in the way that governments can be corrupted, and then you find that, lo and behold, the people are serving the government rather than the government serving the people. Third category for stealing recognizes the principle of private property is gaining fruit from labor that is not performed. This is the adage of something for nothing, getting something cheap. Gambling is regarded as improper in a biblical world and life view because gambling is defined by the high nature of the risk, and so gambling is improper, and it's stealing before what else you have and who else your family is involved in. Investment, on the other hand, is defined by a measured calculation of risk and patience, more importantly. And so there are 2 different things there, but gaining fruit from labor not performed is considered a sin in Scripture. Litigation can be a way of stealing. The cost of judicial trial is regarded as punitive and a way of manipulating other people. Abusing, breaking, abandoning a contract or agreement, lying, cheating, stealing from an employer in subtle ways, disregard or theft of the property of others, assuming that you can get away with it. You might come up with any number of excuses why that's the case. The 4th category is disregarding your accountability to the Lord. This is not in the priority of what should be first and foremost in your mind. It's just simply on the list. I'm not saying that your duty to the Lord is 4th in the line. I'm just saying that it just got on my list in the 4th place. You cannot honor the Lord with your wealth by neglecting the Lord's day, first of all, the energy and the effort that it takes to worship God on a regular basis, to worship His name, to honor the tithe, to act out in the Christian life in a world that is slowly becoming more and more pagan all the time, to choose the world's priorities, to to not be accountable or responsible for your budget, to be deep in credit card debt. All of those kinds of things are ways in which you are stealing, and Scripture warns us about that. Cheating and swindling earthly authorities out of due citizenship is one thing that we do before the Lord as well. Failing to budget money, failing to make the most of every opportunity, just being lazy, being distracted, all those kinds of things fall into place. When it comes to benevolence, private property necessarily implies exclusion. What is mine belongs to me, and that means it does not belong to you unless and until I give it to you. So circumstance, industry, opportunity, favor are not going to fall on everyone the same, and so also will the inevitability of achievement, prosperity, initiative, fortune, circumstances, which will bring, by nature, by definition, an imbalance of wealth. Someone may over here inherit a whole bunch of wealth and never do anything with it in their lives. Somebody over here may work hard all their lives and see very little profit coming from it. That also is not that's not condemned in Scripture. We're told that that's what we are not to compare one with another, but we are to work with what we have, and we are to be faithful to God for it. But at the same time, we are to be responsible to, or to rather have a response to poverty. Poverty is something that when we look at somebody else and they are down and out, when they are without enough to get along, it's very easy for us to judge them, to condemn them, to dismiss them, to say they haven't worked hard enough, to be an authority over them, if you will. But God says that responding to poverty among us is a covenantal responsibility, that we have a duty to see the needs of others, minister to them in a right and proper way, and to do so with a sense of answering to God. There is a scale of priority that is even taught in Scripture with regard to this. We are to take care of family first. We are to take care of Christians second. And then we are to take care of giving extension and benevolence to the poor in general or in the world third. So there is even a biblical priority that is given to us that we are to follow and answer with. And that's an important thing that we try to remember as a church, for instance, when our deacons are approached for need, financial support. They want to go through those three priorities and make sure that they are addressing them in their proper order. And of course, any response to poverty that the church gives is to be done not with a sense of, okay, now you owe me, look how good I am, but with a sense of mercy because God has been merciful to us, and grace because God is gracious to us as well. So the church, for instance, does not loan to somebody, but gives, because we don't want to be in the business of saying, now you owe me. We want to be gracious about how we handle that, and not to be doing it in a self-serving manner. So we approach the eighth commandment realizing it is more than just simply taking care of things. It really is we are charged to take possession of that which God has given to us. And ultimately it's not our ownership, it's the Lord's. And we're reminded in 1 Corinthians that we are not our own, we are bought with a price, and everything we do must be to the Lord's glory. He says in Ephesians 4, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Give no opportunity to the devil. Let the thief steal no longer, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. So that's the application, the outworking of the commandment. Now, there's lots more that we could talk about. There's the response to theft, which is what Bob brought up, the idea of, when somebody takes your cloak or even abuses you, slaps you on the cheek, how are you to respond in mercy and grace and in the witness of Christ? But the act of stealing, of course, is the focus that we've been on. So I appreciate the comment. We can't cover everything, I guess. Any comments or questions? You want to carry forth with what you were saying?
Guess I could. I was hoping you would.
I'm out.
What you would say on that matter. I mean, there's a lot of ways to go with that.
Yeah, there's lots to talk about.
But then there's ostensibly a limit to that. I mean, at some point, I think it's right to defend your property, but,
Well, you have a responsibility to defend your property. You really do. And but I think that goes along with what Christ says, especially in regards to giving your cloak. If somebody steals your cloak, give him something else as well. But I think more the one thing that always catches me is if someone requires to go with you a mile, go with him another. I think that's also the response the Christian has if he is able to express that benevolence that we're talking now. Now we're talking about giving benevolence to somebody who is guilty. And so justice is not first and foremost in our picture there. It's the mercy and grace of God. It's the same kind of thing whenever we come up with a dilemma of somebody who breaks the law and is arrested and put on trial for it, becomes a Christian in the meantime. The church is always asked, well, does that mean that you forgive him and you just let him go free? No, there's a difference between justice and man. Justice in society. Justice in society must be served, but there's a difference between that and the benevolence of the Christian to forgive. The one stolen against may say, I forgive him completely, but society demands justice. And so both must be recognized. There can't be an elimination of the latter for the sake of the former. Yeah, Martha?
I was going to say this part in here, the last part where it says, "Speak no longer steal, but rather let him labor doing honest work
Right.
with his own hands." That kind of flips back to the very first position that the owner of something has to take care of it and to keep it right.
Right. Yep. Yep.
Right.
Particularly pertaining to the response to theft, kind of going back to that. So where do you draw the line between ownership of private property and Christian benevolence to turn the other cheek? So are you not allowed to fight and defend and even take a life to defend your private property?
Okay, the question is, where do I draw the line between defending my property and turning the other cheek? Right? I think that Jesus' instruction there in the Sermon on the Mount is very bold for one particular reason, and that is saying, don't forget that this is not your property, it's the Lord's, and that you are to hold it with a loose hand. To regard only your right to private property in your response is not enough. He's saying the Christian also must demonstrate that everything he has is owned by the Lord, and that his first and foremost priority is to demonstrate the gospel to this other person. And so there is both, I think. He doesn't say, if someone steals your cloak, it's now his. You just have to let him go. It's still your cloak. You have a right to it. But at the same time, you also have an obligation, Jesus says, to to see his need, if he has one, and to minister to it. So it's a tension that he's deliberately putting there, that he doesn't want us to come up with a simple answer for.
And having the thief do the honest work is providing a need.
Well, yeah, but that's not my responsibility necessarily to put him to work.
Right.
It's his charge to work.
Right.
Okay. Well, appreciate your time. We'll move on to the 9th commandment next week as we try to get done by the end of the year here. Let's close.